I'm going to do a little ride-along review of the Jet 9. This is my first time actually riding the Jet 9 up in the mountains. I've been riding the Sentinel the last few days, which is my enduro bike. So I'll talk about the Jet 9 and kind of how it rides, but also maybe a little bit of comparison, how it compares to an enduro bike like the Transition Sentinel, which is of course a long travel 29er. So as I mentioned earlier, I was going to do this video as more of a ride along and talk about the bike, but I ended up riding with someone at the trails, so I figured I'd just do a voiceover and talk about the Jet 9. So this is going to be pretty much my midterm review of the Jet 9 and the first review after really putting it through its paces in the mountains. I'll have to say that the Jet 9 really impressed me riding in the mountains. So I had been on my enduro bike, the Transition Sentinel, for 2 or 3 rides before I jumped on the Jet 9. And I was honestly a little concerned that maybe the Jet 9 would feel a little bit twitchy. So the head angle on the Jet 9 at 67.5 degrees is 3 or 3.5 degrees steeper than my enduro bike. So I thought on the real tech stuff that I would feel like the bike was a little bit too twitchy. Also, the chain stays are shorter. But the Jet 9 feels so playful and poppy. It's almost like getting on a 27.5 trail bike after being on a 29. That's kind of the feeling that I get in being able to just kind of throw around the bike. So the first thing that I noticed is the climbing. And when climbing on this bike, I generally just put the shock in the middle setting. I rarely locked out the shock. I think I did it a couple times on fire roads. And the nice thing about locking out the shock, by the way, on fire roads is that the shock is completely locked out, so you can get out of the saddle and stand, which I like doing. I don't like being in the saddle all the time. I like being able to lock out the front and the rear and stand up on fire road climbs that are pretty smooth. And like I said, I left the shock in the middle setting when climbing, especially on rougher stuff like, roots and rocks, which we have a lot of up here in North Carolina. And I was able to really just allow the tire to absorb the hits better on the climbs, because there were times where, there was a big root and, you really had to keep that traction going. I'd rarely had any pedal strikes on this bike. I think I had a couple where the crank hit a really big root trying to get over it. But other than that, the bottom bracket's a little bit higher on this bike than some of my other bikes. And that really helps when you're climbing. So the biggest difference you notice on a trail bike like this versus my enduro bike, and I'm doing some comparisons here because comparing it with an enduro bike or even a cross-country bike really kind of brings out the best qualities of a trail bike when talking about it. So climbing, the bike just feels so much lighter. When I jump back on an enduro bike, it just felt like I had a weight pulling me backwards a little bit compared to this bike. Now, my Sentinel does climb extremely well for a bike that big, but this bike, it's why you ride a trail bike. You don't feel hindered on the climbs. And even on the smoother stuff, I hands down would prefer a trail bike like the Jet 9, like the Transition Spur, that kind of category. Even coming downhill, you just feel like you can throw the bike around more. It just feels more manageable. The front end on the Jet 9 feels really light, and that's for 2 reasons. One is the head angle is a little bit steeper. Also, the chain stays are shorter, and you feel like you can just get the front end up easier, and so it gives that front end a light and agile feel, which brings out the playfulness of the bike. Again, especially on the downhills where you're going pretty fast, but yet you're still wanting a bike that can get around things, and that's where this bike really shines. Another thing that I noticed about this bike is the stiffness of the frame. So the Jet 9 frame, let's compare it to the Transition Spur. The Spur is like 3 pounds lighter than this bike, but the frame's a little bit more flexy. which has its good points and its bad points. But this frame being so stiff, that's another thing that adds to the playfulness of the bike. So I feel like, you know, going from corner to corner, the bike will really just pop in and out of the corners, and that's because of the stiffness of the frame. Another place where this bike surprised me is on the rougher descents. I even did a descent, it was called Stone Mountain in DuPont. I'd never really even heard of it. I just found it on the map and saw that it climbed like an insane amount of elevation in a short amount of time. And it was hike-a-bike going up some of it and coming down. It was an out and back. I didn't really go very far. It was really overgrown as I got further up the trail. But coming back down, I wanted to see what the Jet 9 would do, and I was really impressed with how this bike felt compared to an enduro bike. That trail was enduro. Now, yes, you have to take it a tad bit easier on the Jet 9 because the head angle is a little bit steeper, but honestly, it's not much. And the suspension, it didn't feel as that cloud feeling that I get on a longer travel bike. So my enduro bike is 30 mil travel more in the front and 30 more in the rear. So there are times when you get that pillowy cloud feel over the really rough stuff, but this bike was not that far off. And it did not feel twitchy on those descents, which really surprised me. I thought maybe the front end would be less manageable at speed, but it really wasn't. And that was, again, something that really surprised me. Maintenance-wise on the Jet 9, I really have not had any issues at all. No flat tires, no drop chains. The shifting has been flawless. The Shimano XT drivetrain is absolutely rock solid. I do actually prefer it a tad more than SRAM. SRAM, sometimes you get that feeling like the chain's trying to skip out of a gear, and I've mentioned it before in some of my videos. I can't tune it out on some of the bikes that I've ridden, whereas the Shimano XT, I don't get that. I didn't really feel like I needed a lower gear on any of the climbs. There was one where I was almost maxed out, but I mean, we're talking 20% grade or more, and still the gearing was fine. I've also mentioned before that I prefer shorter crank arms on a trail bike or an enduro bike, 170s. This bike has 175s, but because the bottom bracket's a little bit higher, I really didn't miss that. I mean, you do get more torque with 175s versus shorter ones. And so that's an advantage, but I appreciate that bottom bracket being a tad higher on this bike if you're going to run 175s. Another thing that felt really good in the mountains is the wider bars, the 800s, and the shorter stem. I think it's a spot-on spec for this bike. One thing that I did notice when jumping from my enduro bike to this bike is the seat tube angle is a little bit slacker on this bike than some of the more modern, really steep seat tube angle geometry bikes that have come out lately. But it was only something that I noticed for the first couple minutes. It almost felt like the saddle was a little bit too low, and then I did, the heel check method. I even measured the saddle height, and it was fine. But I didn't really feel like that hindered me on the climbs. This bike manuals better than any other bike that I've ridden. Now, I don't do manuals that much, but just lofting the front end over stuff, especially when you're going over drops. For some reason, I guess the shorter chain stays and the head tube being a little bit taller, this bike just manuals so well, and again, helps it feel poppy and playful. So to wrap up this video, this is a bike that I would probably choose on 80% of my riding in the mountains. And I can't believe I'm saying that because I love riding enduro bikes. I love coming downhill on an enduro bike. But bikes like this, the Spur, the Jet 9, all these bikes, these 120, 130 mil travel 29ers, I honestly, after this trip up here in North Carolina, I am more convinced than ever that this bike is going to be plenty for most of the trails that I ride, even in Pisgah. Now, Pisgah is where I really prefer my enduro bike, but I could take this bike there and I'm going to get up the climbs faster. It's going to feel more poppy and playful, and it's still going to be very capable on the descents. I would have to hold back a little bit more on this bike compared to the enduro bike, but that's not really a bad thing sometimes. You're going the proper speed for the bike that you're on, and it's fun either way. So that'll wrap up this midterm review of the Jet 9. So on this trip, I took the Sentinel on this bike. My next project, my next trip, it's going to come up in about 4 to 6 weeks, is I'm going to go on a trip with this bike and the Transition Spur. I'm going to compare those because they're really similar. The spur is lighter. The spur is like I said, 3 pounds lighter. And so I'm going to see kind of how these bikes feel riding them back to back. I'm also going to do some back-to-back comparisons on more of the technical trails that we have in Florida, like at Santos. And so stay tuned to the channel for those videos because I'm really curious to see how those two bikes compare. Any questions or comments, drop those below. Thanks for watching.